The first piece of film ever created was made in the year of 1877. The film was under the title of Test, and we found it in a warehouse that belonged to my best friend's long-dead grandfather. As the title says, this was simply a test film and nothing more. Or that is what the title would lead you on to believe. Back in those days, a recording could only go on for less than a minute, so anyone going into this, they wouldn't expect much. And surprise, it wasn't much at first. This film was like all early films, black, white, and soundless. Also incredibly dull. It was only about 35 seconds long, and consisted of a man wearing a black suit, walking on an empty sidewalk, and a large crowd of people on the sidewalk opposite of him. It was nothing special, and again, it was just a test. But one thing was very strange about the film. After reviewing it 10 times in one sitting, we started to notice the small changes that would occur every time we watched it. Sometimes a man sitting down on a bench would be slightly moved over to the right or to the left. Sometimes a woman wearing what looked to be a light gray dress would be wearing a dark gray dress. It was just small, almost unnoticeable changes. This was fascinating for the few that watched the film, myself included. This was also completely impossible, but somehow it was happening. The small group and I continued to watch for about 10 more minutes, and the changes became bigger and more noticeable, more terrifying. One time it was a minor car accident, and the car drivers came out yelling at each other. Nothing too bad. Another time it was just a couple arguing. Then we got about 20 minutes in, and things began to change drastically. Sometimes the crowd of people walking would change into a crowd of people fighting, brutally assaulting each other with blades and blunt weapons, and sometimes there were guns. Sometimes the crowd would be replaced by a pile of bloody, sometimes dismembered bodies. Things just got worse and worse from there. A man slamming a baby repeatedly on the pavement, a woman gutting a man while a child shoved her own thumbs into her very own eyes, a man in a wheelchair set on fire and pushed down the street between the two sidewalks. Just horrible, awful things happened, and they kept getting progressively worse and worse. After about 35 minutes, we all started to hear sound coming from the film. This was also impossible. Every film made back then was completely incapable of having sound. This made things so much worse. It's one thing to watch people die, but to hear their cries and screams, it makes it so much harder to bear. We could now hear the sound of knives cutting through the flesh of victims, and screams of children as they're tortured, the sounds of explosions coming from off screen. Eventually, the building behind the sidewalk, opposite the lone man walking, had disappeared completely and showed off two towers side by side. The Twin Towers. We all knew what was coming next. The first plane hit, next play, the second plane hits, the next play, people are jumping off the building and hitting the ground, making horrible sounds. This film was made in 1877. There was no possible way for any of this to be happening. It then showed off multiple other tragedies. The Columbine shooting, VTech, that Colorado theater shooting, public executions by the Nazis, and many more. That's when I noticed the one thing that hadn't changed this whole time. The man in the black suit walking on the sidewalk, he hadn't changed once at all. His movements, his suit, face, hair color, skin color, height, everything remained exactly the same. The sidewalk as well, that never changed. This is when I gave him the moniker the Deathbringer. Eventually, I started to feel physically and mentally sick. I felt like I was going to vomit. I felt tired. ridiculously hungry, insane, cold, dizzy. I felt like I was dying or something. I passed out around 60 minutes of viewing, and I woke up hours later. Apparently the others had passed out as well. We were all bleeding from the nose and mouth. We looked up and saw one last play on the projector. It was the Deathbringer walking on the sidewalk outside of the building that we were watching the film in. When he reached the end of the street this time, he started to turn his head to the building. When he reached the end of the street this time, he started turning his head to the building, and then the projector died. Since then, we have had the film taken from us by what I assumed to be the FBI or the CIA people or something like that. We were told not to say anything, but as you can see, that didn't stop me from talking. Not like anyone is going to believe me anyway. That's why those people aren't even keeping an eye on me. Well, at least I hope not. Anyway, we were taken to a hospital to be checked out. Surprisingly, we had nothing wrong with us physically, but mentally it was the complete opposite of okay. Since then, my memories of that night have become very blurry. Initially, I started writing this as an attempt to remember more of the incident, but as I continued to write, I found out that I really don't want to remember. I don't want to remember a goddamn thing. I have nightmares every night of horrible, awful things now. Something like that film would have shown. It's been that way for the past year, and I've had it. As for my friends that were in that group, I haven't heard anything from them, and they've since been reported as missing. Apparently this happened over the span of a year, but I didn't even know until I attempted to reach one of them through family. I didn't keep in contact with them, and I didn't really want to. If I had talked to them, that would only result in my memories of that awful night becoming more clear. To be honest, I was kind of relieved to hear that they were missing. Since they're gone, my memories that night will be forever obscured. I guess I really don't want to remember that night subconsciously. I see no reason to really keep going on like this. Ever since that day, I started going outside less and less. I'm now starving, but I can't build up the courage to go out. Why? Because sometimes at night when I look outside, I swear that I see a man in a black suit walking on the sidewalk opposite of my house.